All right, guys. Well, we are live here at Framing the World. I am your host, Paul Wittenberger, with a very special live stream here today. We are going to be talking with Pastor Tommy McMurtry. Now, for those of you who don't know who he is, we have him on the show all the time. He's a great pastor his church is based out of Rock Falls, Illinois. So if you haven't heard of him, make sure you check out his website at givemelibertybaptist.org. That's givemelibertybaptist.org. But Pastor, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing really good. Excited to be on the program. Always enjoy doing live streams with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. The reason I wanted to have you on the program today is to talk about the similarities between Isaac and Jesus. There are some real profound similarities when you look at the story of Abraham and Isaac, and then you look at the story of Jesus. And I'm going to pretty much just let you talk the entire stream today because I just want to go through these similarities, just any of the ones you know. And I'm sure there's ones that we might not even think of, guys. So if you think of any similarities, put them in the comments. But the reason I want to talk about this is because in our new film, Temple, we are going to be talking about this subject. There's actually a scene in the movie where we go through the similarities between Isaac and Jesus. Anyways, let's get to today's topic, the similarities between Jesus and Isaac. Go ahead, Pastor.
Yeah, so obviously, anyone who's ever read Genesis 22, you cannot read Genesis 22 and not see Jesus and the crucifixion all over that passage. But and the deeper you look, the more you see, and there's a real reason for that. And it was clearly on purpose because we see in Hebrews chapter 11:17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And I love this verse. It says, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Now, this is huge for several reasons. For one, at this point in history, no one has ever risen from the dead. We've got a lot of examples of people rising from the dead in the Bible, but at this point in history, no one had ever risen from the dead, yet Abraham believed God could raise Isaac from the dead. And he believed that God would do that because God had said that his seed was going to be multiplied as the stars of heaven through Isaac. So Abraham had so much faith, he knew that God cannot fail to come through on his promise. So even though he's told me to kill Isaac, if I kill him, God's just going to have to raise him from the dead. But I think he knew even more than that. We often, thanks to a lot of bad teaching from dispensationalism, we act like they didn't know as much as they did. But because notice what it says in Hebrews 11:19, it said he received him in a figure. And that word figure there is the word parabole, which means a similitude or a parable. That is symbolically a fictitious narrative of common life conveying a moral. So it's like Isaac was received as a parable or a figure or a similitude. He was a picture of something. God gave him to it in that way, and it's as though Abraham understood that story. And folks, I think he did. And so when we're going through and we're seeing this great faith, it did take great faith, but Abraham just believed God. And the picture, the parable is definitely that of Jesus Christ. And so if you think of some parables, I'm not watching the live chat or anything right now, but go ahead and just put the ones that you've noticed in there. We're going to mention several of these, but first off, in Genesis 22:1, it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. And he said, take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. Now, few things about this passage here. For one, he said, take thy son, thine only son. Well, what about Ishmael? He also had Ishmael, but understand that Isaac was the son of promise. He was his only legitimate son, you could say. And we see too that in Romans chapter 9 and verse 6, because many people, they obsess over a physical line that we see in the Bible. And even to this day, you have people who are very hostile towards anyone who would say anything negative towards Jews, but they are also hostile towards Muslims. And they'll say, well, because they're from Ishmael, they're not from Isaac. But wait a minute. Romans 9:6 says, not as though the word of God hath taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of promise are counted for the seed. For this is the word of promise, at this time will I come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by our father, and he's talking to the Romans, and he said, our father, Isaac. Paul told them in Galatians 4, now we, brethren, he said this to the Galatians, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. So understand, the reason God said, take thy son, thine only son, whom thou lovest, I think Abraham loved Ishmael. I have no doubt Abraham loved Ishmael. But God only recognized the child of promise, and God recognizes those who are of faith, not those who are of a biological line. So we see that picture right there that's consistent with what we learn about in Romans 9 and in Galatians 3 and 4, that God recognizes the children of promise. It's not about a physical line. It's not about a physical seed. And so in verse 2, it mentions how he told him to go to the land of Moriah. And he said, I want you to take him into a mountain that I will tell thee of. And we know in 2 Chronicles 3:1, it says, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So at this point, Abraham has not possessed Jerusalem. The Jebusites, this land is called Jebus at this point, the land of the Jebusites. But God always knew what was going to happen in this area. And so he tells him, go into the land of Moriah, and I'm going to tell you about a mountain where I'm going to want you to go when you get there. And so it says, and Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And I don't think that's a coincidence here. We also have 3 days here, because understand too, at this point, when God tells Abraham, I want you to kill your son, and we all know the story, he doesn't kill his son, but in Abraham's mind, he's losing his son at this point. And interestingly enough, it's after 3 days where we see God end up providing a lamb. And not to get ahead of myself, but I don't even think that's a coincidence. The Bible adds that then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And so notice him laying the wood on his son. Now, what do y'all think that is a picture of? I seem to remember a story that comes later where Jesus is carrying his cross to a place where he is going to die and pay for sins, and where he's going to rise again on the 3rd day. So I don't think these things are in the Bible by coincidence. And it says in verse 7, And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went, both of them together. And what an amazing statement that was. And it doesn't say God will provide for himself a lamb. I mean, you could take it that way for a burnt offering, but I believe Abraham was speaking prophetically right here. And the reality is the lamb that was going to take away the sin of the world was going to be, God himself, who would come and be born of a virgin, who would take on him the seed of Abraham and would offer up himself as a sacrifice. I don't think this is a coincidence here. It says, so they went both of them together. They came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And you know what? I do not believe what we're seeing here was a sneak attack that Abraham did on Isaac. Abraham's over 100 years old, and chances are Isaac is probably a grown man at this point. He's probably a young man, but I don't think he was just some small kid that Abraham was able to overpower. I think he willingly, and most people would agree, he willingly allowed his father to do this to him. That's how obedient of a son he was. And the reality is that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus willingly submitted to the will of his father and went to the cross. I'm sure Isaac was not excited about what was about to happen, just as Jesus was not excited about what was going to happen. He was in great agony. His soul was exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. He was tempted through this, but he also was able to learn obedience, and he submitted himself and allowed himself to be put on that cross, even though he could have stopped it. And I have no doubt Isaac could have overpowered his father, who was well over 100 years old here, but he didn't. He submitted and did exactly what his father wanted and allowed himself to be bound. And so it says in verse 10, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And I think that's you could say a picture within a picture. Without a doubt, that ram represents Jesus Christ, who died in our place. And here we see this ram who dies in the stead of his son, Isaac. And I believe that also is a picture of Jesus Christ, who took those of us like Isaac, who are of faith, of promise. Jesus took our place on the cross. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And Jehovah Jireh, it's believed that means God, or the Lord, our provider. And God, he called him that because God provided himself a lamb, and God provided the sacrifice for our sins and the way of salvation. God did all those things for us, and without a doubt there was a picture of it that day. And as a result of what Abraham did, Abraham is known as the father of faith, and God has named those who are of faith children of Abraham because of this great faith that he showed in being willing to offer up his son. And he says, goes on in verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gates of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. And so we see another promise of the Messiah right there. And we all understand that that was fulfilled through Jesus Christ. So you have Isaac, the only son of promise, the only legitimate son that's of promise, Isaac. And again, Abraham had another son that was of the flesh, just like God gave his only begotten son, Jesus Christ. Well, you do realize, I think we forget this, God had another son, not one of promise, not an only begotten son like Isaac. Luke 3:38 says, which was going through the genealogy of Christ, so which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of Adam, which was the son of God. Adam came before Jesus. Adam was of the earth and of the flesh. Jesus Christ was of promise and was of the spirit, and he was the only begotten son of God, and he was the one that God used to pay for the sins. So just like Isaac had an Ishmael, Jesus had an Adam, and just like Jesus was the only begotten son and the only legitimate one, it's the same thing with Isaac. And so the similarities are just many in that story. And also, I personally believe that the place where Isaac was offered up is the place where Jesus would be offered up. God knew that someday his son was going to be offered up there. And so God told him to go into the land of Moriah. And what's interesting too, in verse 14, it mentions, and Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And what does that mean exactly? In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Well, I do believe it's very clear that the mount of the Lord, that would be Mount Zion, which is where the temple was. And I believe we're seeing right there is, where this took place, it could be seen from the mount of the Lord. And I believe where Jesus was crucified was directly in sight of the mount of the Lord, of the house of the Lord, just east of Jerusalem. And we see in 2 Chronicles 33:15, it says, and he took away the strange gods and the idol out of the house of the Lord, and all the altars that he had built in the mount of the house of the Lord and in Jerusalem, and cast them out of the city. So again, where the temple was, that was the mount of the Lord. But I believe more importantly than what took place in the mount of the Lord was something that was going to take place someday, that was in sight of the mount of the Lord, just east of there, out on a area nobody really thought much about. Jesus Christ carried his cross without the gate, and he died and paid for the sins of the world. And we see in Hebrews, where you had the writer of Hebrews trying to encourage the Jews away from the things of the law and the things of the temple and trying to get them to serve Christ. He says in Hebrews 13:10, we have an altar whereof they have no right to eat, which serve the tabernacle. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp. And we know those offerings were taken without the camp to the east, outside the eastern gate. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. Jesus didn't suffer on the Mount of God in the temple. No, he was taken without the gate. And then he says, let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. And so while under that old covenant, they had that house of the Lord, they were supposed to pray towards Jerusalem. It was all about Jerusalem. When Jesus brought in the new and better covenant, they called on the Jews that, hey, it's time to leave that temple. Let's leave this place. Let's follow him without the camp, bearing his reproach. And Jesus did. He went and he carried his cross without the camp, I believe, to the same spot where God had told Abraham, I want you to take your son. And so, what God kind of started that day, where a son was almost sacrificed, but he stopped it. God stopped it because he said, you know what? No, I'm going to take care of this later with my own son. And that's exactly what he did through Jesus Christ. And so I believe God had Abraham do all these things for several reasons, because God was basically giving a parable here of the gospel. He was giving a figure of what Jesus Christ was going to do to pay for the sins of the world one of these days. And so you can't read Genesis 22 without seeing Jesus all over it. Jesus is what it is all about. And you know what? It's sad to see many Christians today wanting to get back to their Hebrew roots, going back to the things of the temple. No, we've been called away from those things and towards Jesus Christ. And I believe that's an example of the gospel in the Old Testament. So I don't know if I haven't been following the live chat, but I don't know if anybody's seen any other similarities in there, but those are just a few that I wanted to mention to you.
Man, how powerful. I have never thought of that Jehovah Jireh verse before. That I think you're right on that. That is powerful. That's awesome. If I'm gonna think about that a little bit more, because maybe we should add that into the film, because I think that's a good point.
I mean, honestly, I'm not 100% sure on the interpretation of that, but as I, because again, I'm reading a lot of these passages now, just kind of with a new frame of mind, now that I've been to these places and actually have a good picture in my head of what's going on. And it's like, if you think about the Mount of the Lord is Mount Zion, and this thing's going to, and that Jesus was crucified just east of there. I mean, it looks like that's what it's talking about.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think you explained it really good. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about is another topic we talk in the movie, and this is something that I think is super interesting, and something you alluded to earlier in this conversation, but is in Genesis 22:2. And let's go here real quick to this verse here. It says, and he said, take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. So God actually says, go to the land of Moriah, into one of the mountains that I'm going to tell you of. So, you know what? God, I believe, took him to the exact spot where Jesus would be later crucified. It makes only sense that he would do that if he took him to a specific mountain, and this whole thing pictures Jesus. It makes sense that he would have taken him to the exact spot that Jesus was crucified, which I think, that is so powerful once you realize this. Not only that, the Bible talks about Isaac being a lad. And if you search out that term, lad, it mentions that as being an older person. I mean, if you do, I should have done more research on it to have the exact verse. But if you have you done that research, Pastor, where it's what's actually referencing an older adult when it speaks of lad?
Not like on the use of the word lad, but I do know that pretty much across the board, people agree that he was a full grown man. In fact, I mean, I think people are just guessing. Most people tell you he was 33 years old because they believe he was probably the same age as Jesus, which I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. I think that makes sense.
I mean, this was literally a figure of Jesus Christ and what he was going to do. And so, and I don't believe that God would have told Abraham to sacrifice him on the mountain where the temple was going to be, because God always knew that it was going to be Jesus who was going to offer up himself as a sacrifice without the camp. And God knew someday he was going to be calling people away from the temple. That temple is just a figure. It was a temporary thing that God did want for them, but it was ultimately to point to Jesus Christ. And so it's just interesting too that temple faced directly east faced directly the spot where Jesus would offer up sacrifices. And so it's like we've got a lot of people now, they're all wanting to kind of look back towards the temple, but the temple, it was looking towards where the real sacrifice was going to take place, kind of pointing the way to the Messiah, to the real sacrifice, because no sins were ever washed away by what took place in that temple. They weren't able to do those things. It was what was going to take place before the temple, or what God was going to provide, in the sight, something that would be seen from the mount of the Lord. And so, yeah, I think it was in the very same spot, personally.
Yeah, I think it only makes sense that it would have been. And another thing that I wanted to bring up, Pastor, and this is a topic I've never heard you discuss, and it's probably because you could never know the truth on this, but I just want to get your opinion. I know it's not based on the Bible because the Bible doesn't really specifically say this, but when Jesus was crucified, he carried his cross, right? So when you do research it on like how heavy the crosses were back then, they were like 300 pounds is what I heard, which seems like it seems hard to imagine that he would carry a 300-pound cross. So what I've heard a lot of people say, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, is that he just carried the beam because the wood was so scarce during this time that they already had the pole in the ground, and then what they would do is they'd have the guy carry the beam, and then they would place the beam on. Have you heard of that, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's speculation, and you can't really know for sure about that. But here's the thing, though: if they're driving nails in his hands and his feet, then you would have to have the cross laying down and then stood up. And typically, too, the Bible says all his bones were out of joint. And so what they would do is they would, they'd have the cross laying on the ground. They nail the hands and feet. Then they stand the cross up. They drop the bottom of the cross into like a hole, so it will stay standing up. And when they would do that, it would take their bones out of joint, so they're not able to, pull themselves up as much. And so, I personally think he was probably dragging a full cross. It would make more sense. I mean, doesn't matter a ton. Probably not, but yeah, we know they pierced his hands and feet. So,
Right.
I don't think the pole would have already been there in the ground. Otherwise, I don't think they just nailed his hands, hung him up there, and then nailed the feet. I think they probably did it all together, laying down.
Well, I guess to be devil's advocate, I guess they could have just had, because you're right. I never thought of that. You're right. They do that because they want to break yeah. So I guess what they could do is they could have done is had the post up there, just not in the ground, and then attach the crossbar. But anyways, we just speculating. No one really knows. I have a hard time picturing Jesus, who, I think even a strong man without being beaten and all these things would have a really hard time. And I know he had help, but have a really hard time carrying a 300-pound cross up, a hill.
Well, I mean,
a hill. So it's like,
yeah, again, it didn't have to be 300 pounds. And he did have help. He did have to have help because it was such a heavy cross. So,
what does the passage say? Does it say what?
And it calls it a cross.
It calls it a cross, yeah.
Right. And so that's the thing, and a cross, definitely seems to imply something that is, crossing each other. He's not carrying a beam,
right.
And then you have the Jehovah's Witnesses that talk about him carrying a pole. They believe he just had one nail go through two hands and he kind of hung over like that. But that's not a cross,
yeah,
at all. At the end of the day, a lot of the stuff, I worry about anyone who just kind of casts shade on a cross because it's the preaching of the cross. And so just anything to kind of just, mess with people's minds on that and cast doubt, I think is, I don't know, just I get concerned about it.
Right.
I think he probably carried a full blown cross, but
The reason I'm asking is because I never have thought about it either until about 2 days ago. Well, I'm editing the film and I was thinking about it, and I was just thinking, wow, that would have been really hard to go up the mountain with that, because it would have. I mean, it's not a huge mountain, but it was a pretty good sized mountain. So I was thinking, like, how
well, the
did?
thing is,
Yeah.
well, I mean, yeah, I'm just trying to picture the location. I don't think that any of the stuff took place within the temple complex, because if it did, like in Robert Cornuke's book, he talks a lot about it, and there's a ton of evidence. The Jews will tell you this today over there too, that there was a bridge that went from the temple to the
Right.
Mount of Olives where they would do those sacrifices and
Right,
stuff.
and they would have taken him on that bridge, and he would have
Mhm.
been tried at Fort Antonio. So, but yeah, would he have made his way through the temple and then up, or probably not, huh? Because he's a criminal. I don't know.
And
Who
as
knows?
far as like what point he started carrying the cross too,
Right,
we don't really know for sure how far that was. The problem is too, um, a lot of what you hear about him carrying the cross and all that, it's all based off like, the Via Dolorosa that's over there, that is all completely bogus as far as, because that stuff all leads to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we've already shown, on my program, is not even possible that could be the place where Jesus died on the cross. So, um, most of what you read about where people describe the carrying of the cross is based off the Via Dolorosa that is not legitimate.
right,
So, we've there. You're not
right.
going to find. I've not come across any writings describing, the path Jesus took carrying the cross based off the right temple location. So there's a lot that we probably don't know about that.
Right, and I don't think anyone knows. I've never heard anyone talk about it. I've literally read every book on the topic and every article, it seems like, and I've seen I a lot of the speeches and stuff. I've never heard anyone bring this up, so that's why I was kind of curious your point of view. Someone commented, remember the omission of detail is not a contradiction. I agree. We're not talking. I don't think there's a contradiction here. I'm just trying to
Mm-mm.
picture it in my mind. That's all. And I and,
Right.
and I heard someone bring up this idea that it was just a crossbar, and I was like, oh, I'll ask Pastor what his thoughts are on that.
Well, and the thing is too, though, according, and I don't know a ton about the legitimacy of this place, but according to them over there, Caiaphas's house is where they say Jesus stood trial and everything, and that's a lot closer to where we believe he died on the cross than Fort Antonia is. So, because I think you went to, I went to Caiaphas's
We
house
went there. I don't think
without
I
you
did.
one of the
Yeah.
nights. What's that? Did you ever go over
I
there?
didn't. I wish I would have though now.
Okay, but
But
yeah, Caiaphas's house seems pretty legitimate because it's real close. It's not very far. It's just uphill a little ways from the city of David, where we believe the temple was. And they say that's where Jesus stood trial and all that. So they have like all the stations of the cross going from, I think, I don't, I think it starts somewhere around there, but it goes the opposite direction. So, where it's actually a shorter distance from Caiaphas's house to where we believe he died on the cross. So,
yeah.
yeah,
All right.
that's something to look into.
Well,
That'd be a good conversation with Robert Cornuke. I'd like
yeah.
to hear his thoughts on Caiaphas's house because that's a pretty cool place. But I don't know.
Well, I'm sure he's been there. Since he goes on tour over there like 3 times a year, and they're constantly doing stuff. And then he also goes over there on other times. So, But anyways, that was our show today, guys. I just wanted to have this conversation. I think it's super interesting to talk about these kind of things and to just try to picture them in your mind. And so I appreciate you coming on the show here today, Pastor, and just let me know your thoughts on these different subjects. What is your website, Pastor? Just give it out and how people can find out more information on you.
Yeah, so our church website's givemelibertybaptist.com or .org. I'm on YouTube, youtube.com/givemelibertybaptist, or the Spirit of Prophecy 1611 is where I do a lot of prophecy stuff for the new podcast. So if you check those out, I'm also on Rumble, pretty much Odyssey, Facebook, so Twitter.
Are you on Twitter yet? Are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter. Yeah, I'm on Twitter or X.
Yeah, I actually, it's funny because I was never on Twitter this whole time. I've never been on Twitter. I've been signed up on Twitter since 2010. So I had an account, but I never used it until about a month ago. And I must say, I'm loving Twitter. I have totally abandoned Facebook at this point because Twitter is like you scroll and it's just like it's back in the heyday. You feel like you're back in the heyday of Facebook. It's just all this awesome content that I'm seeing that I'm like, yes, this is what I want to see.
Yeah. No, Elon definitely has made Twitter better for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so twitter.com/Tommy McMurtry2. That's where you can find me. That's where you can find me on Twitter. I'm mainly on there just fighting with liberal Baptist and pre-tribbers and Calvinists and stuff like that on there. I'm pretty ornery, but
well, I just kind of kick myself for not being on there longer because when I guess what happened is in 2010 I went on Twitter and it's just like you can post like a couple words and that's it. And I was just like, this is stupid. I'm not good at one-liners. So I just logged out and I never logged back in. But now it's like Facebook. I mean, you can post links to videos, you can do whatever on there. So this didn't mean to be an infomercial for Twitter, but I'm really enjoying it, and it's probably not going to last very long. So I'm just like sucking it all in right now because I'm sure it's going to get censored eventually and be just like Facebook.
Yeah, well, I get in trouble on Twitter because I'm not a writer and I don't, you have like few words you can use. And so I typically come across as really blunt and like a jerk on there. And so a lot of people don't like me because of Twitter. And then it's like after they get to know me in person, they're like, oh man, you're not near as bad as I thought. But it's just, I'm not a writer. I don't know how to put mood and stuff like that.
Yeah, you got to put the characters in to show.
Yeah, I don't really use emojis. It makes me feel like a Gen Zer.
I guess you're too old for that.
I'd rather come across as a grumpy boomer than than a trendy Gen Zer. So
all right, well, that is the show here today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you do your own research on these topics, and don't forget to check out our website at framingtheworld.com and see more information about our temple film. The exact link to the temple film will be in the description of this video, so you can click on that as well. But check out what we're doing here, guys, on the temple film. It is going to be an amazing film. I cannot stress it enough to people. I just want people to, and I know they're going to love it. As soon as they see it, they're going to be like, wow, all this information, I've never heard of any of this. And you were right this whole time. I appreciate you making this film. But, right now, it's just hard to get people excited about this because I just don't think they know much about it. So go over to framingtheworld.com and support me, guys, if you can. I'm still trying to raise money to finish this thing, working my tail off. I made some really good progress today on the film, and it's really coming together. I'm on that point of the film where it's like it's getting exciting again to make this film. So I've been in the down in the depths for many months now. And now it's coming up and it's getting exciting. As the scenes come together and as it ties together, I'm really getting excited about all these, about this movie coming out. So support it, guys. Go to framingtheworld.com, click the link in the description, support the movie, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Pastor, for coming on the show, and God bless, guys. Thank you so much.